Good afternoon, everyone. I just heard the Zoom lady say recording in progress. We're just filming this, so if you want to hide, you can hide. My name is Christopher Sand, and I am the director of the newly rebranded Center for U.S.-Canada Relations here at Johns Hopkins University School of International Studies. I can't take great credit for this center because it was started in 1969 by Robert Mundell, future Canadian Nobel Prize winner in economics, and Bella Balassa, who was a member of the economics department of the main campus of Johns Hopkins in Baltimore. And the purpose of creating the center was to put Canada into the mix for the students who come here and help to drive American foreign policy and the American leadership in the world. I'm pleased to say we've had some amazing graduates. One of the things that is a central part of our program is today's lecture, which is the Thomas O. Enders Memorial Lecture on U.S.-Canada Relations. I can't think there has been a better time for having a frank conversation about the state of Canada's relations. Earlier this morning, here in this very building, together with McGill University's Max Bell School of Public Policy and the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario, we launched something that we're pleased to call Commission for the Second Century of Canada-U.S. Relations. The Commission co-chairs include our speaker today, but also the Honorable Jane Harman, who's here in the front row, 9-term member of Congress from Los Angeles, and one of the people I've met in my life. It's not that uncommon, but one of the people who has been an absolutely remarkable leader on Canada-U.S. issues, never losing sight of the fact that the Canadian relationship is a particularly important one. Our goal over the next 2 years through this commission will be to take a look at what the next century will look like. Canada and the United States established formal diplomatic relations, direct diplomatic relations, through an agreement with Britain in 1926, and the first ambassador, Vincent Massey, came to Washington in 1927. The house that was chosen for Canada's first embassy was right next door to the building we built, the NHTSA building, that was the home of SAIS. Then, under Alan Gottlieb in the 1980s, Canada moved its embassy to this lovely building behind it, and we followed them. So, whatever the embassy thinks, SAIS is your stalker. We are going to be as close to you as we can get. Today's speech brings to Washington and to this podium a very dear friend who has been very good to me. She served as a fellow and as a member of the advisory board for the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars Canada Institute. I have taken students up. Some of you in the room came with me when we went to Toronto just in December to talk about finance and economics. And our speaker today was kind enough to see the students, to have a chance to talk with you about careers in Canada and careers in life. She's a remarkable person. She came to politics. She was elected as an MP for Ontario, but she came from Cape Breton Island in Nova Scotia. Not the poshest part of Canada, but she made her way forward. She earned a law degree, married, has 2 great kids. She served as a member of Parliament and then in the cabinets of former Prime Minister Stephen Harper. She was Minister of Labour, Minister of Transportation, which is really important now because she was the leader who helped to get the Gordie Howe International Crossing over the finish line, or at least get to the point where we were building it. There were a lot of things. And she served as Minister for Natural Resources. Now we call it Natural Resources and Energy. It's always been the federal energy file, even though energy is a provincial responsibility. The feds have a role, and that has been her role. So somehow she has been a leader in Canada's relations who's talked about pipelines, power lines, bridges, and still is willing to talk to Americans and still is willing to talk about the Canada-US relationship. So please join me in welcoming the Honorable Lisa Raitt.
Thank you very much, Chris. That was awfully lovely. It's a full room and you're eating, so that's a good thing. I appreciate it. Please do go on. It's okay. I'll get lunch later. I was very honored this week to be named to the Prime Minister's Advisory Council on Canada-US economic relations. And I didn't know when I agreed it was like a 2-year gig, but I guess it's a 2-year gig, and I don't know if you read anything into that. But I will tell you one thing, that since the naming of that, my identity has been actually stolen from me, literally, and I'm blaming the Prime Minister for all of that. So I spent the last hour on the phone trying to cancel all my credit cards, all my debit cards, because suddenly somebody else thinks that they're Lisa Raitt and is having a great time in Florence and Barcelona in the moment. So I blame Mark Carney for many things. One of them is this, because he brought me to notoriety and people think that I have the money to pay for their European vacation, which I don't, but nonetheless. That's why I have my phone up here, just in case I have to cancel yet another thing. But in any event, Chris, thank you very much for having me here today. It is absolutely an honor to deliver the Thomas O. Enders Memorial Lecture. It's named for a diplomat whose career embodied the complexity, the resilience, and the strategic importance of the relationship between Canada and the United States. And this afternoon, I want to talk about a proposition that may actually sound counterintuitive. And it's this: the United States, often seen in Canada as a constraint on its energy ambitions, is in fact the single most important force turning Canada into a global energy superpower. So let me start with this image. It is early morning somewhere on the west coast of Canada, and a tanker is leaving Kitimat. It's full, and it's bound for Asia, not bound for the United States. You see, for generations, Canadian energy moved almost exclusively south, but this ship is heading west. And the most surprising part of this story was this: that ship, in large part, exists because of the decisions made right here in Washington. And today, I'm hoping to explain to you why I think this. To understand the story, we need to go back to a different moment, before LNG exports, before trade wars, before shale transformed the continent. We're going to actually start with a dear departed friend and colleague of mine, the Honorable Jim Prentice. Jim was Premier of Alberta as well. He served in Mr. Harper's cabinet in a variety of portfolios, most, I think, importantly, Indigenous affairs, and of course, he had the environment file. Jim wrote a book called Triple Crown. And in his last book, he wasn't describing a country without resources, quite the opposite. He was describing a country with extraordinary potential that it could not fully realize. But his diagnosis was simple and devastating. He said, Canada's energy challenge is not a resource scarcity, it's market access. He said that dependency had consequences. Canada was not setting prices, it was taking them. And Jim's solution was clear: build pipelines to tidewater east and west, build LNG capacity, reach global markets. In his view, Canada could only become a true energy superpower if it escaped the gravitational pull of the United States. It was a powerful argument. It's when we first started coining the term energy superpower. But history has taken us on a different path. When Justin Trudeau came to power in 2015, the framing shifted. The language became one of balance. The environment and the economy go hand in hand. And at first glance, that does seem to be a bit of a departure from a Prentice framework. Climate policy moved to the forefront. Carbon pricing was introduced. Environment assessment processes were strengthened. But if you look more closely, if you follow the pipelines, the refineries, the electricity lines over the span of the Trudeau administration, you actually see something different. Canada and the United States were actually becoming more integrated, not less. Oil continued to flow south into refineries designed specifically for Canadian crude. Natural gas moved seamlessly across the border. Electricity grids became more and more interconnected. But alongside this integration came friction. Keystone XL became a symbol of US influence over Canadian infrastructure. And at the same time, the shale revolution was quietly rewriting the rules. The United States moved from a perceived scarcity to abundance with extraordinary speed. Oil production surged. Natural gas flooded the market. Imports declined and exports rose. And suddenly, Canada faced a new reality. Its largest customer was becoming its competitor. And then came a moment that fundamentally altered Canadian assumptions about the relationship. In 2017, under Donald Trump, the United States did something that would have been almost unthinkable a decade earlier. It imposed tariffs on Canadian steel and aluminum under Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act, justified on national security grounds. Canada, a NATO ally, a defense partner, the largest supplier of energy to the United States. Suddenly, Canada was being treated not as an automatic partner, but as a potential risk. And I have to tell you, it is really difficult to overstate the psychological impact of that moment on Ottawa. For decades, Canada had operated under an assumption, rather stated explicitly, but deeply embedded in policy thinking. And that was that the United States was a reliable, rules-based partner. So if Canada could be targeted on national security grounds, what did that mean for energy, for pipelines, for electricity, for the broader economic relationship? And around at that same time, NAFTA was renegotiated into CUSMA USMCA. Now, the new agreement definitely preserved market access, but it also reflected a different tone. There was a sense that the relationship had become more transactional. One senior Canadian observer put it bluntly at the time, we still have a rules-based system, but we no longer have a trust-based system. And that distinction changed how Canada began to think. The energy industry, however, they saw this clearly. The Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers began emphasizing with increasing urgency the need for diversification. Canada's energy sector needs access to diversified markets to remain competitive, is what they said. While Western Canadian select crude traded at steep discount to global prices, the cost is not measured just in dollars, but in foregone investment, in delayed projects, and a lost opportunity. The message from industry was consistent. Canada needed to connect its resources to global demand. And yet, paradoxically, it would actually take actions by the United States to accelerate that outcome. The Inflation Reduction Act marked a turning point. In 2022, with one piece of legislation, the United States redefined the energy economy, not just through climate ambition, but through industrial policy. Massive capital flowed into clean electricity, electric vehicles, hydrogen, carbon capture. Supply chains were reorganized. Incentives were structured to favor domestic production and allied integration. The United States became something new, the organizing force of the North American energy system. So Canada faced a choice: compete from the outside or integrate from within. And it chose integration. But even as Canada chose integration, the nature of the system was integrated into began to change again. And there's another scene worth imagining. It's not on the coast of BC this time, but here in Washington, DC, inside a committee room, maybe a cabinet room, where the conversation has shifted from climate ambition to economic security, from emissions targets to supply chains, and from cooperation to competition. The transition from Joe Biden to Donald Trump in 2025 did not simply represent a change in tone. It represented a change in emphasis, one that Canada could not ignore. Now, under Biden, the United States had already redefined energy policy, as I said, through the Inflation Reduction Act. And what that did was it mobilized capital at a scale. It tied incentives to domestic production. And for Canada, the signal was immediate and it was clear. If you wanted to participate, in the future of energy, electric vehicles, batteries, hydrogen, carbon capture, you would need to align with the United States. And so Canada moved quickly. Critical mineral strategies were accelerated. Battery supply chains were linked to American manufacturing. Electricity exports were reframed not simply as trade, but as part of a continental decarbonization system. Integration. Canada was not competing with the United States. It was positioning itself within its orbit. But that return of Donald Trump shifted the frame. The language of climate did not disappear, but it did recede. And in its place came something more familiar, but also more forceful. Energy dominance, national security, economic leverage. Trade tools returned to the foreground. Tariffs were no longer exceptions, they were instruments. Supply chains were not simply economic, they were strategic. And energy was not just a commodity, it was power. For Canada, this was both unsettling and clarifying. Unsettling because it reintroduced uncertainty into our relationship. The lessons from the Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act were not theoretical, they were lived. Canada had already seen how quickly the United States could redefine a partner as a risk. But it was also clarifying because it reinforced something that had been emerging for years. Canada could not rely on any single version of the United States, not the cooperative version, not the protectionist version, not the climate-driven version. All of them were real. All of them would return in different forms over time. And so Canada's energy strategy evolved again. But it did not abandon integration because we couldn't. The United States remained its largest market, its closest partner, and the center of its supply chains. But Canada accelerated diversification. LNG exports to Asia were no longer just about price, they were about resilience. Oil exports to Tidewater were no longer just about access, they were about optionality. Electricity interties, critical minerals, and clean energy partnerships continued, but with a sharper awareness that alignment with the United States carried both opportunity but risk. So in this sense, the shift from Biden to Trump didn't reverse Canada's trajectory, it intensified it. Under Biden, Canada was pulled into an integrated, subsidized, decarbonizing system. Under Trump, Canada was pushed to protect itself against volatility, to hedge against policy swings, and to ensure it had alternatives. And together, these two phases produced a single outcome. A Canada that is more integrated with the United States than ever before and more determined to reach beyond it. And this is the deeper lesson. The United States does not present Canada with a single stable policy environment. It presents a range of possibilities, cooperative, competitive, sometimes contradictory. And Canada, in responding to those shifting conditions, has become more adaptive, more strategic, and I think ultimately more capable. That tanker leaving Kitimat that I told you about earlier, the pipelines reaching Tidewater, the supply chains linking Ontario to Michigan and Quebec to New York, these are not the products of a single policy moment. They are a result of a country learning over time how to navigate a relationship that is at once indispensable and unpredictable. And in that navigation, Canada has found something it did not fully possess before, not independence from the United States, but resilience within it. Now let's go back to today. Under Mark Carney, the language of Canadian energy policy has shifted, but not in the way many expected. Carney has repeatedly described Canada as an energy superpower in clean and conventional energy. And at first hearing, it sounds like a synthesis, a bridging of two worlds. But if you listen more closely, you hear something else. you actually hear Jim Prentice's vocabulary, energy superpower, but it's embedded within a different architecture. Oil and gas are still there. LNG exports are still central. Pipelines, though less prominently discussed, remain foundational. But they are now part of a broader system that includes clean energy, clean electricity, critical minerals, carbon capture, and global capital flows. Carney's also framed the issue in geopolitical terms. In a more fragmented world, countries that can provide reliable energy will be indispensable. That is not the language of retreat. It is the language of strategic positioning. Minister Hodgson translated that into execution. Canada must build major projects faster if we are to compete globally. The story shifts from language to execution. And this is where the story becomes even more complicated, because Canada's greatest constraints are not external, they are internal. There's a moment in almost every Canadian energy project when the conversation stops about being geology or engineering and becomes something else entirely. It becomes about time. And then very quickly, it becomes about trust. If the United States has been the external force shaping Canada's energy trajectory, then Canada's greatest internal constraint has been its own ability to build, its ability to decide in time. Major projects in Canada take too long. And it's not because Canada lacks capacity or expertise, but because the system through which decisions are made has become layered, iterative, and at times indeterminate. Mr. Hodgson put it plainly recently: Canada must build major projects faster if we are to compete globally. In a world where capital is mobile and timelines are tightening, delay is not neutral, it is actually decisive. Consider the arc of major projects over the past decade. LNG proposals that began with strong commercial logic often spent years navigating federal and provincial assessments, overlapping consultations, and evolving regulatory standards, sometimes midstream. Pipeline projects became multi-year exercises, not only in engineering, but in litigation. Even when approvals were granted, they were frequently subject to further review, to challenge, or to reconsideration. All this is resulting in uncertainty. The Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers has consistently emphasized this point. Policy certainty and timely regulatory processes are critical to attracting investment in Canadian energy. Behind that language lies a simple calculation. Investors compare jurisdictions, and Canada's timelines have been uncertain. But if time is one axis of the problem, trust is the other. And it is here that the issue becomes more complex and more consequential. At the center of that complexity is the question of Indigenous consent. Over the past several decades, Canada has undergone a profound legal and political evolution in its relationship with Indigenous peoples. Court decisions have affirmed the duty to consult. Governments have committed to reconciliation. The language of partnership has replaced the language of unilateral development. This evolution has been necessary, and it has been just. And it has fundamentally reshaped how projects are conceived and approved. But it has also introduced a tension that Canada has not fully resolved. What precisely does consent mean? Is it consultation? Is it accommodation? Is it agreement? Or is it, in some cases, a veto? The system aspires to partnership, but it often delivers ambiguity. On one hand, there are powerful examples of Indigenous participation and leadership, Many of the LNG and resource projects now include Indigenous equity ownership, and the government has loan guarantees to support it. Communities have negotiated benefited agreements that provide long-term economic opportunity. And in some cases, Indigenous nations have become the proponents themselves. The Haisla is a great example. These developments represent a profound shift from stakeholders to partners. And yet, on the other hand, there remain projects where opposition from some communities, sometimes opposition within that nation, creates uncertainty that is difficult to resolve. The legal framework requires consultation, but it does not always provide clarity on final authority. Governments seeking to respect rights and avoid conflict often proceed cautiously. Proponents facing multiple layers of engagement encounter timelines that stretch. And communities navigating internal governance and external pressure face decisions of enormous consequences. The result is a system that is, at times, both rigorous and fragile. Rigorous in its intent to include and respect. Fragile in its ability to produce timely, durable outcomes. This is where the question becomes most difficult and where honesty is required. Canada has not yet fully reconciled two very legitimate objectives: the need to build infrastructure at scale and speed, and the commitment to meaningful Indigenous participation and consent. And too often, the system attempts to achieve both without clearly defining how conflicts between them are to be resolved. And so decisions are delayed, projects are stalling, and opportunities pass us by. Other jurisdictions, meanwhile, well, they move more quickly. The irony is that delay does not necessarily produce better incomes for Indigenous communities, better outcomes for Indigenous communities. In many cases, it postpones economic participation, infrastructure development, and long-term revenue streams. That's probably why you see such an impressive group of the First Nations Major Projects Coalition coming together to get their word and message out on Indigenous participation and partnership. At the same time, rushing decisions without genuine engagement risks repeating the mistakes of the past. There's really no easy resolution, but we do have some emerging principles. One is clarity. Clarity about timelines, clarity about process, clarity about who decides. And another is equity, not simply consultation, but participation, ownership, revenue sharing, governance roles. And the third is consistency, a system that produces predictable outcomes even in complex cases. If Canada is to fully realize its potential as an energy superpower, if it is to build the infrastructure that connects its resources to global markets, then it must address these domestic constraints with the same seriousness it brings to external challenges. Because in the end, as I said, the greatest risk to Canada's energy future is not the United States. It is delay. Delay in decisions, delay in construction, delay in aligning principles with practice. And resolving that delay requires confronting not only regulatory design, but the deeper question of how a modern resource economy operates within a framework of rights, reconciliation, and shared prosperity. So, in that sense, the story of Canada's energy future is not only about pipelines and LNG terminals. It is about institutions. It is about trust. And it is about whether Canada can build not just infrastructure, but a decision-making system capable of matching the scale of its own ambition. Only then can it fully convert the external pressure we have discussed into lasting advantage. Only then can the promise of being a global energy superpower be fully realized. There's another current running beneath the story, less visible than pipelines, quieter than trade disputes, but no less powerful. And it is the mood of our country itself. Spend some time in Canada today, in boardrooms or in construction sites, in provincial capitals or small towns, and you begin to hear a shift in tone. It's not uniform. It's not always loud, but it is present. It's a questioning of the relationship between Canada and the United States. It's a frustration with the dependence. It is emerging at precisely the moment when Canada is more economically and structurally integrated within the United States than ever before. And it's a tension that is so difficult to ignore. Part of this sentiment is rooted in experience, I would submit. Canadians watched as tariffs were imposed under national security provisions. They saw how quickly a close ally could be treated as a strategic risk. They followed the twists of pipeline politics, where decisions made in Washington could reshape Canadian economic outcomes. And more recently, they have observed the scale and ambition of American industrial policy. Subsidies measured in the hundreds of billions, supply chains drawing inward, incentives designed to privilege domestic production. So to many Canadians, the message has been clear. The United States will act in its own interest, decisively, unapologetically, and at scale. So we ask, where does that leave Canada? But sentiment is not only about policy, it's about perception. There's a growing sense in some quarters that Canada is being pulled into an American system on terms that it does not fully control. That integration, while economically necessary, carries with it a risk of diminished autonomy. You hear it in conversations about critical minerals, where Canadian resources feed American manufacturing. You hear it in debates about electricity exports, about battery plants, about supply chains that seem to run north-south more than they do east-west. But occasionally you hear it expressed more bluntly, a concern that Canada is becoming an adjunct rather than a partner. And this is the environment in which Mark Carney is operating. His response has been careful, it's been deliberate, he's been calibrated. He does not confront anti-American sentiment directly, but he does not dismiss it. Instead, he reframes the relationship. Where others might speak of dependence, he speaks of indispensability. In a more fragmented world, countries that can provide reliable energy will be indispensable. Where others might see vulnerability, he emphasizes leverage. Canada is not simply integrated with the United States, he suggests. It is essential to it. Energy flows north to south, but so does reliability and so does stability. And so does the capacity to supply allies in times of disruption. At the same time, Mr. Carney's been careful to signal that integration is not the same as submission. And this is where diversification re-enters the narrative. It's not a rejection of the United States. It is a complement to it. LNG shipments to Asia, oil reaching global markets, trade relationships extending beyond North America. These are not framed as acts of separation. They are framed as acts of strength, a way of ensuring that Canada engages with the United States from a position of choice, not necessity. I do believe that anti-American sentiment, if left unchecked, can become a constraint on policy. It's going to make integration more difficult, and it's going to narrow the space for cooperation. But we can't ignore it because it carries its own risks. So the approach has to absorb it, to acknowledge the frustration while redirecting the conversation towards opportunity, to say in effect, yes, the United States acts in its own interest, but Canada can act in its own interest as well. And those interests, while not always identical, are often aligned. Too much emphasis on integration and the government risks reinforcing the perception of dependence. Too much emphasis on distance and it risks undermining the very system that supports Canadian prosperity. And so the strategy has been one of quiet calibration. Integration where it creates value, diversification where it creates resilience, language that emphasizes partnership, but policy that preserves optionality. What is striking in the end is how this sentiment, this undercurrent of skepticism, fits into the larger story. Because in a paradoxical way, it reinforces the very dynamic that I've been tracing. The more Canada feels the pull of the United States, the more it seeks to define its own space. The more it questions the relationship, the more it invests in the capacity to operate within it on stronger terms. So even here, even in sentiment, even in perception, the same pattern emerges. Pressure, response, adaptation. Which brings us back once again to that tanker on the West Coast. It's easy to see it as a symbol of diversification, of independence, of Canada reaching beyond its traditional markets, and it is. But it's also something else. It's the product of a country learning how to live with proximity to a superpower, how to engage without being absorbed, how to integrate without losing agency, how to respond to pressure without retreating from opportunity. In that sense, even with the tensions we see today, skepticism, the questioning, the moments of frustration, it's all part of the same process. These are not signs of disengagement. They are signs of a relationship being renegotiated in real time. And in that renegotiation, Canada's not stepping away from the United States. It is learning slowly but deliberately how to stand within its own orbit and still chart its own course. So as that LNG tanker leaves Kitimat, it is easy to see it as Canadian achievement, and it is. But it is also the product of American pressure. Pressure from shale production that reduced US dependence. Pressure from tariffs that exposed the fragility of assumptions. Pressure from industrial policy that redefined competitiveness. Pressure from a changing geopolitical landscape that elevated energy security. At every stage, the United States applied force, economic, political, strategic. And at every stage, Canada adapted. This is the paradox at the heart of the story. The United States has constrained Canada. It has complicated market access, it has introduced uncertainty into trade, and it has reshaped pricing and demand. And yet in doing so, it has forced Canada to become more resilient, more diversified, and more strategic. It's compelled Canada to build infrastructure that might otherwise have been delayed, to seek markets that might otherwise have been neglected, to integrate systems that might otherwise have remained separate. So in short, the United States has done more to push Canada towards superpower status than any single domestic policy. But this is not the kind of superpower status that Prentice imagined. His world was one of molecules, barrels of oil, cubic feet of gas, shipments of LNG. Prime Minister Carney's world is one of systems, interconnected networks of energy, finance, technology, and policy. In Carney's world, being a superpower is not just about producing energy. It is about shaping how energy moves, how it is financed, how it is regulated, and how it is integrated into global systems. And yet, the United States sits at the center of those systems. So where does this leave Canada? Well, in a position that would have seemed improbable a decade ago, more integrated with the United States than ever before, more exposed to its policies, more affected by its decisions, and yet also more diversified, more globally connected, more capable of reaching beyond North America. Canada has not escaped the gravitational pull of the United States. It has learned to use it. Let me close with this. Jim Prentice believed that to become an energy superpower, Canada needed to break free from its dependence on the United States. History has taken a different path. Canada has been shaped, sometimes uncomfortably and sometimes unpredictably, by American power. And in responding to that power, in adapting to it, in building around it, Canada has begun to realize the very ambition that Prentice described. So when you see that tanker leaving Canada's west coast for markets across the Pacific, remember this: it is not just carrying energy, it is carrying the story of a relationship, complex, strained, indispensable, that is still, even now, shaping the future of both our nations. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. That was a masterclass. It was a lecture. I'm going to be out of a job soon. No, but I think my dean would rather hire you. But that was well, you know.
Done, Chris. One and done. Not happening again.
No problem. You're welcome back anytime. You know, I think it was Wilfred Fry, the Canadian literary critic, who said that in matters of sort of perspective, the Americans often fall prey to hubris, but Canadians fall prey to complacency. And there's a little bit of both of that in the story that you were just telling us.
Yeah, I'm not going to talk about the hubris part because it's not for me to criticize or to characterize, quite frankly. Very comfortable criticizing and characterizing Canadian mentality. And I would say that we have been complacent. And I think it's been noted by many people in the past number of years that this complacency has actually damaged us economically. But I would also say that we were trying to follow a dance partner that was kind of jerking all around the dance floor. Going from Inflation Reduction Act, from Section 232 tariffs to Inflation Reduction Act, no Keystone XL, now another Keystone XL. It's hard to keep up, quite frankly. And I think the lesson that we're learning from all of that is you have to be nimble and you can't ignore it. And you must deal with what's happening within your own borders too. And that's the complacency part that is most damaging. It's not only the reacting to the United States, it's the fact that in the meantime, we didn't shore up the things, we didn't confront the things we need to confront and do the things we need to do and be honest about the things we need to be honest about in order to get stuff built. And that's, I think, exactly where we are right now. And it's not easy. It's not easy being in government these days. It's not easy being in opposition these days because we're all just trying to do the same thing, which is to make Canada better.
I wonder if you could reflect a little bit on the challenge of people feeling part of a Canadian community. The response in a lot of ways to the last few years, I've seen Canadians really rally, but in the past we've seen debates, well, oil's an Alberta thing, there's Saskatchewan thing, and nuclear is an Ontario thing, and they care about the auto industry, but why do we care about that in Quebec? Is there a sense that this moment will create a kind of empathy among Canadians for a shared problem, or is that sort of divisiveness of regions likely to persist?
I don't know if it's a divisiveness of regions. I'm going to say that each region has its own capabilities and it has its own center of economic prosperity, quite frankly. And sometimes it's difficult to understand. Quebec has hydroelectricity, makes a huge difference for them. Alberta, Saskatchewan, they have gas and oil. BC has gas. Nova Scotia has fish. That's where I'm from. That's okay. We do a lot of fishing. But we do have natural gas off the coast as well. I would say that what has happened collectively across this country, though, and across the provinces is the realization that we no longer have the luxury of choosing whether or not to responsibly use our resources. I think that's the common understanding. It may not be that we understand where BC is coming from, but it is, okay, we all have to be able to use what we got in order to create an economy and some prosperity for the people around us, because the relationship that was a trade relationship so important that we built our prosperity on as a nation isn't necessarily going to be the same going forward, and we need to figure that out. So building up internally certainly is on the minds of everybody, but listen, it's not easy. It's kind of like playing musical chairs, and the music stops, and not everybody has a chair. You're trying to figure out what are you going to do next.
I know you have a couple of kids, and I think a little bit about following Canada-US relations. My career sort of starts with Canada-US free trade, and I've lived in this world of trade agreements that are now being renegotiated. And when we talk about a commission for the second century of our relationship, we really are looking forward. But I look around the room, and I do have some people who are closer to my age, but there are also a lot of our students. When you think about looking across the divide, what do you think about Canadians who have inherited a sense of North America, a sense maybe of a Canada-US relationship in this moment of strain? Where do you see them going? What's their future going to look like? And what do they need to retain from the past and not forget the moments that have come before?
Well, according to my 24-year-old son and my 21-year-old son, I know nothing when it comes to the United States, and that's okay. I would agree. They have a very different attitude about it to them. they would love to come and work and live in the United States. They see prosperity, they see opportunity, they see cheaper housing. If you can believe it, I know a lot of you may not believe it, but it's cheaper here than it can be in other parts of Canada. And they don't view it as a shut door at all. They view it as a not a probability, but a possibility for them. If you get into the older demographics of the country, it's a much more stark kind of reaction, but it makes sense. We have our houses. We're not going anywhere. We're very comfortable. That's a complacency. So combining your first question with this one, I think young people, as they try to sort out what it is they're going to do in order to have a prosperous, happy life in the future, all options are on the table for them, which includes mobility that they seek and want to have, which means we need to have a fantastic relationship with the United States, which is why I wanted to be part of the Second Century Commission, because I want to make sure that despite what we're dealing with right now in terms of transactional issues, there has to be a thought to what the next 100 years looks like so that my kids have options that they think they deserve to have. And not an option for them is having no communication and no ability to move between the two countries in a free and fluid way.
It's wonderful. We have, since I was just talking about all of our young people, we have a microphone there, and we really encourage you to ask questions. Yeah, I know.
Congresswoman wants to ask you a question.
Harmon is asking a question, so let me move the microphone around. I'll try not to Phil Donahue this.
You are Phil Donahueing it. That's awesome. Kids don't know who that is.
Well, I don't want to bump at the time of kids to ask questions because this really is about your future, not about my past. But I did want to make just an observation and ask one question. As the new co-chair of this task force, lucky me. I think we could all agree that what Lisa had to say was just inspiring and thoughtful and just exactly what we should be hearing from ex and present politicians. And we're not hearing that from most present politicians. Anyway, I'm lucky to be your partner and I'm going to take full advantage of it. My observation is that not only is the Canada-US relationship realigning, but relationships among the United States, Canada, and the world are realigning. So it's not just bilateral, it is multilateral. And what emerges in this second century is going to be different. I just wonder if you agree with that. But my second point is, and this is a question, you mentioned trust. You didn't elaborate on that. But I think the tone from our leadership, US leadership right now, is very different. And I wonder what that contributes to this atmosphere of distrust. And I want to say, as an American who cares a great deal about this relationship and has worked on many platforms, including with Chris Sands at the Wilson Center to make it better, I just want to say many in America totally disagree with some of the current policies and certainly with the tone. And I just wonder what you have to say about the tone.
I am delighted to be sitting with you. I mean, I fangirled you since you introduced me at a luncheon many years ago at the Wilson Institute. So I'm delighted to work with you on it. And in terms of trust, I think what I was talking about trust in the construct of trust between Indigenous peoples and the projects that are going through their communities. We have to build on that. But your question is valid as well. My answer is this. I think the sentiment that we have in Canada is trust, but verify. And that's the only way that we can approach it, because you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. And there's a lot of interconnectivity like this amongst people, mayors, congresswomen, senators, that is real and alive and important. But when we get down to the nuts and bolts of creating a new agreement or finding a way to remove those Section 232 tariffs, which are very important to remove, it's going to be trust, but verify and make sure that it sticks, because we're all good negotiators at the table and we want to make sure that we get the right decision going forward. It's important for both policy and for productivity and for prosperity.
Excellent. More questions? Any questions? I'm calling you. Sorry, old professor thing. My faculty colleague, John Hoddenbaugh, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Raitt. I was heartened by the tone and the substance of your talk. I personally agree with the Prentice approach very much, so I've lamented the lack of some of the resource development and infrastructure development that's been taking place in the last few years. I was curious if it's a very positive message that you're giving. I'm curious if you believe the current political, regulatory, legislative framework will allow for major projects to be completed. And if there's particular things like Bill C-69 or other issues that might need to actually change, or if you think the status quo is, it's just a change in sentiment, that's all that's needed.
Yeah.
So
my answer is this: whether the prime minister, it comes down to what the prime minister wants to do. Whether the prime minister wants to push and make sure these projects are built and completed, that's a political decision. It's not a policy decision. He has amassed all the tools that he needs in order to make some very controversial calls in getting these projects built in a timely way, in a financeable way. He passed an extraordinary bill, C5, which as a conservative makes me blush, quite frankly. I would never even propose of putting that kind of ultimate power in the hands of one administration, but there you are, they have it. Whether or not they use it is going to be a question. If they use, but I'm going to bring it back to my talk. I do believe that the encouragement to use it will come from pressure being exerted by the United States. It's more like, well, we have to do this because look what's happening here. We must diversify because of the changes in policy in the United States. It's going to be they made me as opposed to I want to, and that's an easier political bite. I hope he does it. Look, I'll pop the popcorn. It'd be amazing to watch. No one's laughing at me. That's a joke. It's easy for me to say because I'm not in government. And please don't call me minister. Thank you, though. Okay. James,
Minister?
No.
The Honorable.
Yeah.
I wanted to echo the comments we made, but also I want to applaud you on the extent of your comments on seeking Indigenous support. Often a afterthought that we needed to get this detail closed, but in this case, part of the framework. We're a year into the Prime Minister's leadership and the work that's underway. What is your sense where we are in the progress on that issue? If you can provide some sense of where we are we getting a full chorus of support for the Indigenous community? Where are we on that? And do you see it lining up with the urgency to accelerate?
Huge progress. We see projects coming forward where they are majority owned by the Indigenous community. They're receiving, there's a whole market, a whole little market area that's developed on Bay Street, how to finance Indigenous equity. I'm not going to plug another bank, but I'm going to have to because we didn't do it. But BMO Capital Markets, RBC, they have both started up Indigenous practices within their capital markets, which means they're trying to raise over $100 million for Indigenous projects. So yeah, it's getting there. And as I mentioned, the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, who is having their conference right now in Toronto, they are there to help facilitate the building of these major projects. So yes. What is going to grab the headlines in the news are the ones that aren't. And that's unfortunate because we have far more wins in the column than we do losses in the column. And Indigenous communities want to participate. I'm from Nova Scotia. You mentioned I'm from Cape Breton. Chief Terry Paul from the Mi'kmaq there. I mean, that First Nation is so prosperous. They bought Clearwater Fishery. They bought a shipyard. They're constantly in major projects and building prosperity for the community. They went from being a zero employer in Cape Breton Island to being the number 2 employer on the island, quite frankly. So these are the stories that are happening across the country. And so you will find that it is getting better and better and better. But I'll give you one word of caution. It's not really a caution. Let me give you a perspective. And I heard this from Francois Poirier, who is the CEO of TC Energy. And he said it so logically, and it made sense to me. He said, when it comes to proposing projects, why do you think that you as the corporation gets to sit with the concept longer than the indigenous community through which the project is going through. So, and I think about it, yeah, that makes sense. I mean, these projects kind of bounce around companies for years and years and years. They get thought about, developed, business plans, scenarios, all that's being developed. And then finally one day they show up in the indigenous community and they want, okay, right now, let's figure this out in the next year, pace of business, we want to move. That's not the way it works. You've got to give due, I think, process to a community. So get in there early. I think we're redefining the rules. There's lots of people around who can help. If there's any, you know, I'm not a big fan of the last 15 years in Canada in terms of how we progressed economically. I think it's been difficult for us, but I can say that on the Indigenous reconciliation front, very proud of what our country has done. I think it's a great thing, and I think it's only going to get better.
Could we encourage this question? We're eager to hear it.
Yes, we can have a student question. Extra credit available.
Oh, there they go. There they go.
All right, good.
Hands went up.
So, hi, thank you very much for your time. I'm a first year student, master's student here. My name is Ju Young from Korea. I have a question about your experience in diversification, in your efforts in diversification, because a lot of countries in Asia and other worlds also factor in different factors, not only economic ones. For example, they have diplomatic ties with other countries. Maybe they're, thinking about how China would react to their, intensifying cooperation with Canada and other Western countries. So after all this experience and diverse considerations, are there a group of countries or specific countries that Canada is trying to focus on when it comes to energy diversification? Thank you.
That's a tough question for me to answer in Washington, but I'll try. Of course. If you take a look, let's talk about LNG for a hot minute, because that's very interesting. If you take a look at the geography of North America, it's only the west coast of Canada that is unimpeded access to the Asian markets. Natural gas in the United States goes out through the Gulf. It's got to go through the Panama Canal, and then it gets to go. We just kind of go, boop, and we're over there. So it's a great calling card. So yes, you look to Asian markets. I think what you may be asking is, how do we view these kinds of relationships geopolitically? And I think that's the right question to ask. You will have seen the Prime Minister have very extensive travel in the past year, and he has really focused on, I would say, reorienting the relationship with China, but resetting the relationship with India. There's two different words there. One is a far more, I would say, expansive look at the relationship. That would be with India, as opposed to China trying to find the areas in which we can work with one another. But I will be very honest, a lot of times, in my personal view, it's only my personal view, do not quote me, I'm not speaking for the country, but we do have to look at these relationships through the lens of the relationship they have with the United States. You have to look at your relationship with China, sitting in Canada, as how the United States views relationships with China. I think it's one of the considerations you do take in when you're making these things. And the reason being is that the integration is important, the future is together, and it's not necessarily saying I'm only going to do what the US wants us to do, but you definitely have to make sure you understand where people are coming from. So yes, India, Vietnam, China, there's a whole bunch of activity happening in that part of the world. I think our ambassadors are run off their feet. They call it moving at the pace of Carney as opposed to moving at the pace of business or the pace of government, because he's on the roll. Yep, see, agreement from the front row here. So everybody is like moving for the first time, and we're using muscles we have not used in a long, long time in our country. I think it's good, and I hope that it does mean that we have some diversification. But as you know, yesterday, the day before, President Trump has announced that he's approving a pipeline between Canada and the United States, and that has gotten a lot of interest and excitement in Canada again. So we'll see. Where's the oil going to flow? Are we really going to diversify? Or are we going to go back south? I don't know. To be determined, TBD. That's part 2 of my lecture next year.
Glad to have you back.
No.
Manolo, I saw you had a question.
Thank you. Thanks so much for the time. My name is Manolo, first year MAR student. I'm from Mexico. And this is also a question about like the third partner in the discussion. You mentioned how
it's really hard and challenging to keep on track with all the changes and all the shifts that are happening here in the States. And I agree with that. And I also agree on how the view from younger generation are changing regarding the United States. The same thing happened in Mexico. I agree that my generation was the first one that we got sold in this idea that we are in this together as North America since the signature of NAFTA in 1992. However, it feels like this project is falling apart. So I wanted to ask, how do you see the future for the region from now on? Do you think that we still can sell this idea that we are set to be the most competitive and prosperous region in the world, or we have to understand from now on that it's just like a transactional relationship for the future?
I really hope I hope we go back to Fortress North America, the economic zone of North America. I think that to me was the best selling feature, having supply chains that integrated all the way up from Mexico through the United States into Canada, the rail that connects us, the pipelines that connects us, the clean energy that connects us as well, not just pipeline, but electricity too. It just makes so much sense for us to be working on the same page. But it's a matter of negotiation right now. And it's a matter of a change in policy in the United States that does cause us to adapt. And we have to figure out how we're going to adapt. My hope is that Canada and Mexico don't lose our relationship as this unfolds. I don't think it will. My prime minister's gone to see your leadership, and I think that I hope it went well. If it didn't, you can tell me later. But it's one of those things that I didn't speak about the Mexican relationship in the speech because I was just focusing on the Canada-US. It does not mean at all that I think it's part that needs to be hived off. I don't think we have a deal without Mexico, quite frankly. I think it needs to be the three parties. It's the only way forward that makes sense. We had the bilateral deal, US-Canada free trade, then we had NAFTA, and we retain it. And I think that's the proper path forward.
Excellent.
Hi, Minister. Thanks for being here today.
Abby?
I'm wondering how you see public opinion in Canada driving some of the policy decisions, especially as it comes to the US in the coming weeks, months, years. I know you talked a little bit about generational divides and how Canadians see the US, but it also seems like writ large, there's a lot more distrust about the US and Canada. I remember seeing a poll that it's not seen as an ally anymore or a partner, but more so as a competitor or a threat to Canadian security. Down in the polling around China, that was unthinkable 2 years ago, and now we're here seemingly in elbows up mode. How long do you see that sustaining? Does that go away with the current US administration? Is this sustained distrust, and how does that affect policy going forward?
Yeah. So public policy. Man, I would say, this is what I would say. Polling is interesting. I mean, Diefenbaker had a phrase, right? He said, polls are for dogs. Pause. So the difficulty with seeking, that kind of information from the public in a moment in time is that you may not be hitting you, for example, is your phone going to get called for a poll? I don't think so. I think these polls are very much skewed to people who still have landlines, and we all know who they are. They're like me, and they are skewed to other types. I think you're not necessarily getting the full cohort of the demographic that we need to hear from in order to make a real statement on what the relationship looks like right now. I'll say that. But I also say that Canada is, I'll give you an example. Just got terrible news that a really good friend of mine's son is being laid off tomorrow because a company in Canada is shutting its doors, and they are devastated. And it's a second time that the company that he's been with has closed in the last 18 months. Economic matters, affordability are going to be the things that are going to drive Canadian opinion. It's not going to be about whether or not we have a positive relationship with the United States. What the political parties have to do is to make sure that in discussing affordability, they focus on how we can become more prosperous. And I would submit we become more prosperous with the United States than without the United States. And that we need to work on our relationship. But doesn't mean, like I said, it doesn't mean that we are going to become more dependent or that we're going to crater on whatever it is that we're discussing at the moment. But anything to do with how we feel, elbows up, all that kind of stuff is going to very quickly disappear when the affordability and economic crunch hits Canada, which is coming at us full force, sadly. People care about their pocketbook. And I don't think they're going to blame the United States for it either.
Interesting. Other questions? Comments? We
Oh, we have a question right there.
Do we have one here in the front row? Friend Ian? Not a student now. He's a graduate.
Congratulations.
Thank you, Minister. My question's on USMCA. What do you see as sort of the American asking points for Canada? What are some red lines from either side? And just sort of your thoughts on the negotiations, and to what extent do you think supply management will be impacted?
Oh, gosh. You know what? Every commercial banker asks me exactly the same question. What's going on with supply management? I don't know. That would be the response. We'll see. There's some, I'm not even gonna say that. We'll see what happens on supply management. It's an interesting question. But what I would say is, first of all, I have not been briefed, even though I'm on the advisory council for the Prime Minister. I have not been briefed. I have no inside information. Caveat. I would say this is my observation going in without a lot of inside information. It would appear that has been said by the administration that the United States seeks to apply a tariff to everything transiting their border into the United States, and Canada seeks to have no tariffs on what is transiting into the United States. Those are your two extreme positions. Where do we end up in the middle? Is it a sectoral question? Is it a quantum question? How much can Canada take in a tariff before it renders a lot of its economy not possible? Those are the things that I'm sure that very smart people in Ottawa are working on right now. But the reality is that I think that's what it comes down to. Either you're paying to come into the United States or you're not. And the lever that is being utilized are these Section 232 tariffs, which are the ones that hurt. CUSMA we have. CUSMA is, USMCA is, it's legislation. It's there. What we don't have control over are the security tariffs. And those are the ones that are causing my friend, for example, to be laid off today. And those are the ones that are really scaring businesses into determining whether or not they're going to relocate to the United States or just decide that they no longer want to have a family business. So they're real deals, and we have a period of time. I would offer one other piece of thought on this one. I know that it appears that Canada's enjoying dragging its feet, and I understand that. I would say my advice is this: there is a law of diminishing returns on that concept, that at some point in time, the waiting for the right deal is going to be more harmful than doing a deal that you have towards you. And then I say this because we are starting to see businesses fall off the cliff. And if that happens too much, there's going to be so much inertia behind it, it would be very difficult to pull it back. So people have to be mindful. Do I have an idea how long that time is? Not a clue. No idea at all. But it's something that I think about in the back of my mind.
It resonates with something you were saying about delay,
Yeah.
as it being decisive as well, even if it seems like you're just waiting to make a decision, it has an impact.
Indeed.
We're very fortunate this lecture has been supported by the Enders family.
Yes.
And Tom Enders was ambassador to Canada during Gerald Ford's period of time. And that came after a previous shakeup, which was the Nixon years. And we got 10% import surcharge. We had a number of other things come in that era, but we then were able to sort of steer things back.
Mm-hmm.
The question's been asked before about, what do we do to get back? Personally, I think more Americans need to listen rather than talk and pay attention to Canada's relationship. But if you were speaking sort of at the Americans, and I know you've been careful not to criticize, which is totally fair, but if you were speaking to Americans of goodwill, and there are a lot of them here, what can we do that would help improve things?
Well, look, I'll come at you from the head. Okay, from the head is we're a fantastic business partner. Have you seen our resources? Look what we have. You don't want us to work with anybody else. Come on in. Everything's going to be fine. We can work this out. From the heart, I would say we're family. families straddle this border. There's my family went to Boston many years ago. We've got the Boston States, as we used to call it. We send you a Christmas tree every year, for goodness sake. You know, these things are important. We have a real solid relationship. Our kids go to your universities. Your kids go to our universities in Canada. We exchange professionals all the time. We learn from each other. We laugh with one another. You get all of our good comedians, and you seem to keep them. And that is why we are stronger together than we are separated. And we shouldn't let an argument over money cause such problems. Look at it for the kids.
I like that. I'm gonna pivot from that. One of the other sponsors of this talk, which has always been supportive for us, has been the Association for Canadian Studies in the US. Mm-hmm. And there was a time when the government of Canada really invested in Canadian studies in the US, maybe a little bit less so the US. But I want to turn to my good friend Andrew Holman here, put you on the spot, Andrew, to talk a little bit about how we reach the next generation and how do we have these conversations with people in the classroom and why that makes a difference.
Well, thanks for putting me on the spot, Chris. But it's actually something that I'm happy to speak about, especially since it's the last week of classes, and there seems to be a kind of an exhale what happens. I would say that, and I'm not quite sure whether how polished this is, but the change in the relationship between Canada and the United States actually moves the goalposts a little bit for us who are encouraging the study of Canada, the study of Canada-US relations in amongst American students. You know, why study Canada has always been the big question. And well, because it's your next door neighbor, because there are people there who have so much in common with you. And when you have less and less in common, in fact, you have a source of antagonism, that sell becomes harder and harder to do. So I think for us, you know, there's a bigger ask, there's a bigger question ahead of us now. And how do we reframe that question? I'm not quite sure. So that's what you get for putting me on the spot. But I do have a question for the minister, if I could, and it has to do less with the Canadian Studies bit and more with messaging from Prime Minister Carney. Change in the strategy of messaging from a year ago March to the present day. I'm convinced by what you say about quiet calibration. I think that makes a lot of sense, and it rings a bell with me with how it's approaching things. But that's quite a bit different from elbows up. And to speak about those two things in the same sentence and to conflate them, I think isn't quite right. And so what's going on here? This is the same guy who in January gave a very eloquent speech in Davos and talked about diversification. Then 2 Sundays ago on CTV tells us that the United States connection with Canada is a source of weakness for Canada that needs correction. That sounds more like it opens up to. So what is it? Can he safely and convincingly to Canadian people argue both things? Or does he have to in order to stay elected? Just what would you say to that?
I was very surprised by the content of the CTV 13-minute infomercial. I agree. I didn't think I thought that language had disappeared for a while, and that's kind of what I was tracking. So it was a bit jarring for me. I can't speak to what his strategy is. I don't know what his strategy is. One could surmise that it's a very popular kind of message in Canada in the moment. Like I talked a little bit about the anti-American sentiment that you are hearing in Canada right now, but it's not as strong as it used to be. Like, yeah, last year was very different from this year. And as our economy moves on in negative, I would say, territory, people are more and more starting to question, well, what are we going to do for ourselves? And that is always a problem for a politician whose answers are medium to long-term in solution as opposed to short-term in solution. So perhaps it's easy to go back to that kind of language that will rile up the voters. But you do that too many times, you become the boy who cried wolf in a sense. You can only pull that out so many times before it becomes used a lot. And we'll see, we'll see where that ends up going. Look, I'm just happy that we're no longer having conversations about whether or not we boo each other's anthems. I mean, that was a very, very low period, I think, in this whole discussion part. And right now, the best thing that I think we can do is to take the heat out of the relationship and just try to focus on what we can negotiate at the table, and then be honest with Canadians as to what it is we are going to be looking at and what it means to us going forward, and that it isn't, whatever we end up with isn't a diminishment of who we are. We haven't lost anything. It's a new set of circumstances. And go back to what I said, every time, this is not new. Pressure from the United States, adaptation by Canada. It has been the two-step our entire existence. And sometimes it works really well for us. Sometimes it hurts, but we still have to continue down the path. So look, at the end of the day, it's a strategy that seems to be working from a popularity point of view, but at some point in time, the shelf life of it does actually disappear. And I don't have any comment on what it means to how people are reacting to it in the United States. I can only speak to how Canadians are reacting to it. Although I did hear rumors that certain ambassadors to Canada were very upset. Not a rumor, he told me, very upset by it actually. So I had the unfortunate, not unfortunate, it was lovely. I was at a round table with the ambassador, Pete Hoekstra, on defense in Canada, like the day after this happened. And he let us know what he thought. Yeah, that was fun.
So Lisa, I think one of the things that your remarks really did for us was to sort of show just how much we depend on each other. And I would be remiss if I didn't take just a minute to thank Maria Liu and Christian Omori, Deja Thomas, who helped us put this together. We've had a great team, and I'm very, very fortunate to have great people around who made this happen. And now we have something very special. We have recorded this. So when you're trying to get your identity back, we can prove you weren't in Florence. You're right here.
Do you know, my phone kept ringing through the whole thing. I'm really afraid that I'm going to Australia now by the end of this lecture because somebody's charging something and my phone is going off. But you were far more important to talk to than saving my credit score. Probably zero now.
We have a lot of witnesses. And I think Aruna would be happy to have you back anytime.
Oh.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, yes.
I think we have